Great. Good evening, everybody. Hi, I'm Alexis Harrison, president of CT169Strong. As you all know, we were a group that started about 3 years ago with the aim of informing and educating citizens on a slew of zoning bills that we saw coming to the legislature about 3 years ago, and we've continued to see this pattern with bills coming that chip away at local control. Tonight, we want to continue the conversation on the zoning bills. We're about halfway through the session, and we want to, continue to provide all of you a deeper understanding of the bills and where we are and their implications on our communities. We have another great panel tonight. We have Senator Ryan Fazio, who represents Stamford, New Canaan, and Greenwich, and he's also the ranking member on the Planning and Development Committee, which oversees or has debated a number of these bills. We have Barry Michelson, who's a professional planner and also founder and president of the Stamford Neighborhoods Coalition. We have Catherine Braun, who sits on the Town Plan and Zoning Commission in Fairfield with me and is also an environmental lawyer. And last but not least, we have Maria Weingarten, who is co-founder of CT169Strong and also sits on the Board of Finance in New Canaan. She's a realtor and she's also a former auditor, so she certainly knows a lot. So welcome tonight. I would love for Ryan to kick things off, if you don't mind. We're halfway through the session. We've seen some of these bills advance. Can you just tell us where we are and give us a quick summary of the bills from your vantage point?
Thanks, Alexis, and thanks 169 Strong for being here. And most importantly, thanks to everyone who is on the call. I don't know how many people from my vantage point, but I am very confident it's a lot. And I'm very confident because throughout this legislative process on these topics in particular, the public has been very, very engaged. And that's very important because on the state level, even though it's a higher level of government than your local government, it is one in which people do listen. The elected officials do, to a large extent, pay attention to their inboxes, to their mailboxes, and to their voicemails about bills that are coming forward and the public's impression of them. And on these bills, many of them, which would roll back local control of our towns and cities, the public has been very engaged and very outspoken, in contrast with a much more, shall we say, concentrated and well-funded effort pushing the bills. The pushback against these bills that remove local control has been broad, it's been grassroots, it's been bootstrapped rather than well-funded by any interest groups. And we're very, very appreciative in the state capitol, those of us who are fighting for a better way on housing and protecting local control. We are very grateful for your involvement and your wisdom throughout the process. So we are just past the main committee deadline called the joint favorable deadline, which is the period that the deadline that committees have to pass bills that are introduced to their committees. And so the main committees that hear issues related to zoning and housing are the Housing Committee and the Planning and Development Committee. The Planning and Development Committee, as Alexis mentioned, is the one where I'm the ranking Senate member, which means the leading member of the minority party on the committee. I'm now on the Housing Committee. And I would say probably the worst legislation has come through the Housing Committee, although there are some, I think, negative proposals that have come through the Planning and Development Committee this term as well, and we're working very hard to stop them, but the numbers are simply against us. So just at a high level, here are the things that have passed out of committee in no particular order. Actually, I will order them roughly in order of most onerous to least. So I think by far the most onerous bill that's before us this term is the Fair Share Act, which potentially could put towns on the hook for billions and billions, tens of billions of dollars across the state. I think 169 Strong's very, very reasonable estimates are that it would amount to tens of thousands of dollars per every individual in the state in liability, because it would enable towns to be liable in lawsuits for building thousands and thousands of units, probably on average, in housing on the taxpayer dime. if they don't do that, then they would have to just assume as of right development until those levels, those mandates of housing stock were built. So this is in some sense modeled after New Jersey statute and policy. It's extraordinarily onerous. It would represent one of the biggest unfunded mandates in state history, maybe the second biggest. So that passed out of the Housing Committee along party lines. The Work, Live, Ride Act, which is 6890, HB 6890, passed out of my committee, the Planning and Development Committee, again on party lines, although there was one Democrat state representative from Stamford who voted against it, Dave Michel. This would put towns on the hook for potentially losing maybe around $100 million statewide of critical infrastructure funding from the state government, including water and sewer funding, brownfield remediation funding, and other funding, if they do not adopt as of right development up to 15, 20, or 30 units per acre around a transit station in the town or city, and it affects over 160 municipalities across the state. The housing authority, so we say universal housing authority jurisdiction bill, which is 6593, which would effectively give housing authorities the ability to act in any other municipality around the state. That passed through the Housing Committee along party lines, although it has to now pass out of the Planning and Development Committee. There is a period of the legislative session we're currently in. It's a very narrow period with a narrow scope where some bills have to go through a second committee. They could be referred from one committee to another. And it's coming to us tomorrow morning on the Planning and Development Committee. Our hope is that we can narrow it in scope so that any housing authority from one city or town does not have the absolute unchecked right to go and do development into another town or city, but at least they have to have the affirmative buy-in from the legislative body of the town in which the other town or city in which they would be building. There's a couple other bills that are somewhat less onerous but concerning. The governor's housing bill, which is 985. Hopefully it can be amended in a way that would be more reasonable, and I continue to have conversations with his administration about it. The omnibus House Bill 6781 is potentially a placeholder to be, I think, filled with a lot more policies in some of these other bills on housing. It's supported by some of the House leadership. SB 4 is a housing bill that's more focused on tenant policies of tenants compared to landlords, and there are a couple other bills. The good news is that the first transit-oriented development mandate was stopped in the Planning and Development Committee, and a beach bill, which would significantly circumscribe the ability of towns and cities to regulate their own parks and beaches, was also stopped in our committee, Planning and Development. So that's a high level of where we are. I'm sorry for going on so long, but we are very much in the thick of things. One major landmark in this session is past the main committee deadline, and that means we will be going to other committees to hear bills, and then we will be going to the full Senate and floor. So your attention as the general public and your voice as the general public is as or more needed than ever in the coming months.
Great, thank you. And thanks, Ryan, for doing that in about 10 minutes or less. I know there's a lot going on, and that was a great overview. Now, I heard the word or the term as of right a few times in your overview. Now, Kathy or Barry, what does that mean for those who, are novices to zoning? Can you describe that?
Sure. As of right means in our regulations, zoning regulations, means it's a permitted use essentially, and you have it as of right without really any conditions unless it's tied to some kind of special exception or special permit proviso in the regulations. But an as of right is a permitted use, an action by either administratively or the zoning board.
Okay, so would that kind of mute more public participation? Because it's as of right, it's essentially, to me, it sounds like more of an administrative rubber stamp type thing, or Is
Well,
there oversight?
it's not a rubber stamp. It's
Okay.
just something you can do if you follow the regulations. And in your regulation, you have certain guidelines. Take, for example, a single-family residential house. It's as of right in a residential district. All you have to obey is the height restrictions, the side yard, if there are sewers that connected to, or you may have septic system, the septic system standards, health standards, basically, but it's permitted use and generally requires minimal oversight of any administrative site. It's just a permitted use that's really just as of right, as we said.
Great, thanks, Barry. Kathy, I just want to talk about the environmental impacts. You're an environmental attorney. That was not brought up, by the proponents of the bills. From what I saw. What are your concerns from an environmental standpoint with these bills? I know there are a lot of bills, but maybe you can just speak, from a 40,000 foot view.
Okay, so in general, any bill which treats all communities the same is not going to be environmentally sensitive. I'll just give a little example. There's a sewer bill coming through now, which would enable much larger septic systems to service, 40 or 50 houses or units or people to be approved at the local level, whereas now it requires DEP approval. DEP does a site-specific review, which is more burdensome and onerous to developers, but that's what you need. You need site-specific review. And that's what is being avoided with most of the new bills. When they pass something that says as of right, or reducing the ability to have a hearing, some of them constrict the ability to have a hearing at all. You are ignoring the idiosyncrasies of the land, including natural resources, open space preservation, habitat. We have some towns, 14 towns that are reservoir towns. They might be 70% watershed. You're treating them the same as you're treating a large suburb, and you're treating them as the same as you're treating a tiny little village that gets 2 building permits a year, which has no demand for all of this. So treating all communities the same makes no sense. And that brings me to the next question is, we have public hearings at the state level, which Representative Fazio pointed out very eloquently
Senator.
just now. Oh, Senator, I'm sorry. And we're listened to. Well, I'm on the zoning commission, you're on the zoning commission. We listen to the people too. That will no longer really be allowed if these bills pass, to hear the things that go on the local level. Land is not like any other asset. I read an op-ed recently where somebody was saying, by having zoning regulations, we're not allowing economies of scale that you would have for any other manufactured good. Well, land is not a manufactured good. It is where it is, and it's completely dependent on what you put next door to it. And any resources that are next door to it will be affected by what you develop. The bills that I've looked at in depth, they clearly, in my opinion, did not have environmental input, oversight, expertise, or anything else. They tend to ignore and gloss over, and actually, I think, have errors in them on what the carve-outs are for some of them. One of them, I think the Work, Live, Ride bill carves out tidal wetlands, but not inland wetlands. Well, that's most of the state has inland wetlands, not tidal wetlands. That was probably a mistake, don't know, but it shows that nobody had input, because as soon as I read the bill, I'm like, oh, where's the inland wetlands? Any environmentalist would have known that. So I think from an environmental perspective, treating everybody the same, not allowing the public to point things out or have full hearing process. And by the way, if you eliminate hearings altogether, question whether you could even have an environmental intervention to raise environmental issues, which anybody can do now by intervening into any proceeding. If there's no proceeding, I don't know how you intervene. So I have many, many issues, and that's sort of the global view of them.
Great, thanks, Kathy. We'll come back to that in a bit. Maria, now, aside from land, what's a broader impact on the communities when it comes to these bills, such as budget, economic? Can you delve into that?
Absolutely. So what we're seeing is, and I guess it's unfortunate, but a lot of these bills, they're not really talking about the exact numbers. They're kind of giving a vague, Work, Live, Ride is kind of gave in one meeting, gave a sort of a range of how many acres. And they gave you a per unit density, but they never gave how many acres. So the concern is that, you're looking at, and I'll go right to the example of Greenwich. So Greenwich has over 60,000. And so we know that they're per the bill, it's 30 units per acre. But then the question is, what's a reasonable amount of land? Because that's the wording that's in the bill, to be decided by a outside coordinator. And when that was a question that was pressed to the group, they said, well, it's somewhere in the range between 50 to 200 acres. Well, since it's a larger community, one could say that if you're looking at the entire state, then that 200 acres would probably be what would they'd be counting on to move against Greenwich. So if you look at that, that's 6,000 units. But what still hasn't been clarified as well is that per train station, and they have 4 train stations. So when you multiply that, that's 24,000 units. And I believe their total units that they have is about 27,000 housing units in total. So what they're saying is that they want to double the housing units. Now, what's the impact of doing something like that? The impact is to your infrastructure, because you have a certain amount of said infrastructure, whether it's fire stations, whether it's police stations, whether it's school, whether you have enough buildings for schools, and those costs add up. And so, and there's a sort of a cliff where it happens. So you have a certain amount of capacity, you can go over capacity to a certain extent, and then your sewer can only handle so much, or your water lines can only handle so much that you have your town water. And then you have to do some serious capital spend in order to be able to meet your extra demand. So that's why I think when we think about as of right, as we were talking about before, single family is not a in itself larger impact. But when you think about these high density situations in any community, and you're adding the expectation is you're opening it up that an entire area that has to be rezoned to be as of right, you can put very high density in there, and you're not really considering the environmental impact of that, or how's the wetlands in that space, or hopefully some of that can kind of go out in the wash a little bit if you're specifically targeting certain areas. But still, when it's a multi-unit project, I think there are a lot more intense considerations for traffic, for all of those things that require a special permit. And I think that's where we have to look at these things a little bit more closely. And that's what some of these bills taking away, requiring as of right, or moving it to a zoning board of appeals to manage a process instead of the proper roles within a town that are already developed and established. Those are the concerns that need to be addressed. And we need to kind of stick back with what works.
Great. Thanks, Maria. I do want to talk to Barry. Now, you're a professional planner. I know you've worked in several different towns over the years. Now, how do these bills, how will they impact the long-term planning of a community? Can you go into that?
Sure. Essentially, it takes it out of local hands, which is a big problem as I see it, because we're set up as 169 towns. And let's face it, we don't have any large major cities. 100 in the scheme of cities throughout the country. 140, which is what our largest city is not a very large number. And basically, we're small cities with a lot of neighborhoods, and each of the cities kind of has a little different flavor to it. And essentially, any zoning commission I have attended to, and I've probably attended hundreds of meetings, land use decisions are made basically and essentially made on sound land use policy. Is it supported? Does it follow the regulations? Does it meet the guidelines? Does it follow subdivision regulations? Light, air. I've never heard of or saw anything other than that. And once you remove it from the local government, the local municipality, you have people in Hartford who are going to be receptive to what's going on in each of the 169 towns. I think not. So it's really taking away local control. And I think that's what all these bills are all about. That's what the local threat is for each one of these bills, basically, is to undermine home rule. And I think that's a very, very unfortunate goal or direction or objective, because no one is going to do it better than the local folks. Even if you disagree with your local plan and zoning board, still you have control locally. The other thing is the appeal process is in Connecticut. Going through the court system is very, very involved and costly. These bills, and this has been an attempt through various legislative sessions. We've seen attempts at regionalization. We've seen some attempts at TOD, which we're seeing now, transit-oriented development. But this has been an ongoing process for, I would say, at least 4 or 5 legislative sessions to try to undermine our local control.
Thanks, Barry. We have a question from the audience here in the chat, and anyone can chime in. What is the overall agenda of the housing and zoning bill advocates? What are they seeking to achieve and why? I don't know who wants to take that one.
I'll take a stab at it.
Okay.
Okay, as a zoning official, as well as a lawyer who has represented environmental interests for about 20 to 25 years, it's hugely concerning. And I start off with the issue of, I've never seen actual documentation for the 140,000 housing shortfall that has been cited over and over again, which is basically the underpinning, I think, for all these laws. Maybe it's correct, maybe it isn't. I've never found the actual calculation with the actual data. That needs to be explored it needs to be disclosed. I don't know where it came from. But even if, assuming we do require a substantial number of new housing, there has to be a better way of doing it than eliminating zoning. I hear over and over again that zoning is kind of like scapegoated or being called the main problem. I don't think so. I think there's a whole slew of reasons why we have poor people in one area, affluent people in another area, farmers in another area. It has to do with many, many things: demographics, economic cycles, jobs, all kinds of things. And I don't think you can pin the blame on zoning, and I don't think zoning is going to solve the problem. And by eviscerating zoning, which basically 8-30G is already done, and that's still sitting out there, you're eliminating all the benefits of zoning. And I never hear about the benefits of zoning. Zoning provides for an orderly pace and an orderly way of development. So when you live in a certain area of your town, you can expect other people to have similar development in that area. You won't have a gas station next to your house, and you won't have a high-rise apartment building next to your house. But most of these bills do just that. They eliminate the benefits of zoning, and that is not being discussed enough. So I think the goal is to add a lot more houses and across the state, but they're not looking at where they need to be, where the demand is, where it makes sense. And they're also doing it in a way which eliminates zoning. And, as somebody I know said, zoning commissions might go extinct if these laws all pass. And we rely on zoning commissioners to answer to their local constituents and get voted out if they do the wrong thing, or get not appointed if they do the wrong thing by their town.
All right. Go ahead, Maria. You want to add in?
I do. We just sent out in our recent email blast our white paper on 8-30G, and I suggest that everybody take a read on that. It's interesting. It sort of was prompted when I heard some of the legislators saying, well, do you know what your percentage is? And why do you only have 2% or 3% or 5%? And it really made us delve down and really understand what are in all those percentages. And I think that many people will be surprised to find out that there are certain of those categories that are just not available to them, or they're not even determined by them. So whether somebody in your town gets a CHAFA loan or a USDA loan is totally out of the control of your town. and so that can cause your numbers to vary widely from one cycle to the next, depending if people are refinancing or going in a different route when they want to fund their purchase of a property. The other thing is that I've come across this recently, is that 830G has unintended consequences as well. So yes, it's created density, and we often talk about that end of it, but we don't talk about the fact that it's deed restricted for a set number of years. And at some point, it's going to come due because a lot of them are going to start to sunset. And I did come across a report recently that showed that within the next 5 years, 5,000 units are going to sunset. Within 10 years, 10,000 units are going to sunset. So we are now on this treadmill of needing to not only develop, that we're told that we have a crisis here, but we need to now make up for the units that are going to be falling off, as well as this need. So I think that we need to really start looking at 830G and recognize what it is and what it's not. And so I think, our hope is that this starts the conversation a little bit more thoughtfully and fully than what we've seen. I know there was a report created by Partnership for Strong Communities. I'm sure I can see this so well here, if you can see it. And they created this in 2021. And so this report had some recommendations in it, which are okay, but the fact that they didn't kind of really go into an understanding of how you calculate your units and where those numbers come from, I think we sort of answer some of those questions that have been missing. So I encourage everybody to do that, because I think that that's part of the issue here, and that's what they're at.
Thank you. And you bring up a good point. You talk about 830G. That the 830G would be in addition to these bills. 830G is not going away. I guess, Brian, what's the legislator doing about 830G? I mean, we've seen that it's created, as much litigation as it has affordability, and it really hasn't created that much affordability in its 30+ years. So, what are you guys doing to address the shortfalls of this?
Well, I think Maria's points are very well taken and incisive. So 830G has been on the books for 30 years. And essentially what it does is it mandates that 10% of a town or city's housing stock must be government supported affordable housing or deed restricted affordable housing. That's not affordable housing, but it's a very, very narrow definition of affordable housing. And it permits developers to do as of right development with 30% deed restricted affordable housing on the developments if the towns do not have that 10%. So it's a very, very clunky way of promoting certain housing development. It hasn't seemingly succeeded in creating economic opportunity or growth in 30 years, and it's significantly demoralized and undercut towns who want to be actively involved in the decision-making process surrounding planning and zoning. So especially in the past couple of years. So this term, I and a few other legislators introduced bills that were bipartisan in nature and that were narrow, that were aimed at improving 830G. We didn't think that we have the ability to repeal and replace it, but we wanted to reform it so that we can promote more types of affordable housing that have local buy-in, that are discrete, that aren't the sort of like concentrated, highly, shall we say, objectionable to many types of development, but units that are developed all over town that have the buy-in of communities, that fit all the infrastructure and environmental and other considerations, quality of life considerations of those towns and communities and government officials on the local level. So they include counting naturally occurring affordable housing. They include giving more points for transit-oriented housing or for senior housing. And we also support other reforms to housing policy that will help create more affordable housing with local buy-in, like improving the voucher system. That should be a priority, and it's something that members of both parties have expressed support for. Giving more flexibility to towns on the type of set-aside 830G development that does occur, and creating a moratorium process from 830G that, shall we say, both incentivizes the creation of housing, but also rewards towns with relief from 830G when they are doing a good job. And the best example there is New Canaan, which was unfairly denied its second moratorium, even though it was creating an enormous amount of affordable housing under 830G's definition even of affordable housing. So I think one of the messages that we've had this term in proposing several bills that are bipartisan in nature, that are narrow, that are focused on both creating housing and ensuring that the localities have input in the creation of that housing, is that there is a better way to solve these problems, to balance the considerations of local control of the environment, of quality of life, of infrastructure, as well as creating more housing stock. There is better options here. And I fear that instead of finding those agreeable bipartisan solutions, that we continue to go down a worse and worse path if so many of the bills that I mentioned in my opening statement continue to proceed and move forward.
Thanks, Ryan.
If I can just highlight one thing that Ryan, I'd love to comment on this. You know, he brought up vouchers. That's a really important one. We did see it. We read an article this year that talked about how these vouchers, many of them are going unused. And then we hear about this housing authority bill, and we heard that New Haven Housing Authority was very interested in starting to develop in other areas. Well, I think part of what their usage there is going to be to use some of their vouchers. Now, if you look at and I recommend everybody look at our sheets too. We have a number of worksheets that we make available to you. It was sent out in our newsletter. One of the tabs is the 830G calculation. If you look at that, you'll recognize that of the 43,000 total units of tenant rental assistance, 9,000 goes to Hartford, 7,500 goes to New Haven. And those are not even the two most densely populated communities. So Stamford, let me find Stamford is on this list. Stamford gets about 2,000, and Bridgeport, which is number one, gets only about 4,000. So how are these allocations happening? How are these fair? And you know, so the thought that New Haven Housing Authority might be interested in developing in, let's say, a Darien or a New Canaan or whatever, and we can't avail ourselves to vouchers so that we can do deeply affordable on some of these projects to make a deal pencil out. But now someone else should be able to come into our town and build and use their high allocations of vouchers. Something seems very unequitable here, and I think we need to have something has to be done to really study the voucher process and to see how this is being managed, because you know, you have to recognize the unintended consequences that happen if you give such a high percentage of all vouchers to just a handful of cities. How is that not concentrating poverty in those areas, or you know, the areas where people are housing challenged? Same thing with giving grant monies. We know that a lot of the largest cities get the grant monies that they use to build column one, which is the government assisted housing. We've been asking for those numbers in the last decade. Just tell us in the last decade how much of the state's coffers money was used to develop affordable in those cities, because that's also telling, because we know as New Canaan that in 2018 the governor took away funding for New Canaan to develop that 100% affordable project that took until 2022 2023 to get done. So we have to make sure that we start, if you want to see more development elsewhere, you actually have to support communities that are interested in trying to do these things. So I just thought I'd mention those two things.
I'm glad you did. Thanks, Maria. We have a few more questions from the audience. In Work, Live, Ride, there are some towns that are exempt from opting in. Can you talk about why that's the case?
The towns that are not opting into Work, Live, Ride. So Work, Live, Ride just eliminated 6 towns. I'd have to look up that. Hold on, here it is. Union, Sharon, Salisbury, North Canaan, Canaan, and Cornwall. And that's because they're in the, they're not adjacent. This is just a made up, you know, again, this is sort of magical thinking here, but it was, you've got transit towns, then you had bus towns, any town that had a bus stop was included, and then they included any town that was adjacent to a town that had a train or had a bus stop. And so the only towns that were sort of eliminated were those 6 towns. And that's they just sort of made a rule, and that's the rule they made.
Okay, thank you. Now, question about the grid. Now, Michael Goldstein is he's asking about, you know, how will all this massive development impact the grid? And I don't think that's been talked about. I haven't seen anything written about that. Do we have any idea of what that would look like?
The electricity grid?
Yeah.
Well, certainly if you're adding to it, you're going to increase demand on the grid. And you know, one of the other ranking memberships I have is of the Energy Committee, and certainly adding demand is going to stress the grid at a time when we're already adding a lot of demand because of the electrification of the vehicle fleet and because of electrification of the heating systems in the state. So the ISO New England, which is the regional regulator, estimates that we're going to see a 60 or 80% increase in demand over the next 20-25 years. At the same time, we're not going to see really any increase in supply because we're taking fossil fuel plants offline, and we're adding intermittent sources of electricity, solar and wind and battery power. And battery power is really technologically not quite there yet. So, certainly New England's grid's going to be increasingly stressed. So the more demand you put on it, is a bigger problem you have. I don't know that these bills in and of itself are going to break the camel's back on that.
Right.
I think that, frankly, I think the camel's back is on the pace to being broken on the electrical grid anyway, which is an enormous problem and something that's been the other top priority for me this term. But adding demand to a short market, which we have on that in that industry, certainly is going to only increase problems.
Alexis, I'd like to add something to that. One of the things we've heard here in Lower Fairfield County is we have plenty of water, that we have no issues with it. We've been told that for over a decade. We've witnessed all kinds of development. And then we started pulling out water out of the watershed from the Bridgeport area. So evidently there is some kind of stretch to the water situation here. Nobody discusses it, but we're continually going through this. Even last year, we lived part of the summer, this past summer, under drought conditions or semi-drought conditions. And it's something that's really not being talked about or investigated. And Eversource seems to be buying up all our utilities. I'm not sure if that's a good idea not to put all our energy and water and utilities just in the hands of one provider. So I think it's something that should be looked into, especially the water situation.
Actually, speaking of water, we have a question from an Easton resident. What about towns that provide 19% of the state's water supply and they only have septic system? Easton is 90% watershed and all septic. We can't do high density without infecting the water supply. What do we do?
Those towns are being ignored. Okay, so the work, live, ride bill, if Easton fails to opt in because it is a adjacent community, doesn't have its own bus station or transit, but it's adjacent to towns that do, it has no sewer infrastructure. It uses septic systems. And I believe their zoning regs forbid the use of community septic, which is for privately owned housing developments. And there's a good reason for that, because community septics are not run by the government and they tend to fail. And when they fail big. There's already a problem with Mill River, which flows down through my town, Fairfield, with individual septic failures. And if you have a community septic failure, the failure will be much larger. And that's one reason they do it. So Easton has, I think, 70 or 80% of their land is watershed land. And these bills do not accommodate that. So I know that certain types of water company owned land, class 1 and class 2, can't be built on. But there's something else called class 3, which could be built on. That is not carved out of the work, live, ride bill. Now, maybe right now that's adequate for what's being protected. Maybe in 10 years, it won't be adequate as development increases in the surrounding area. And as drought could happen, climate change could happen. Maybe we should be preserving more of those lands for water company land, because the best single way of keeping water clean and keeping it plentiful is having natural open space. That also reduces your cost of using chemical treatments to clean the water on the other end, just through a bunch of research I've been doing. And just for an example, Aquarian has done a water diversion where they're diverting, I think now 14 or 15 million gallons of water a day to other areas. And that's a problem, but they're doing it because water changes, the needs change in different places. And we did have a horrible drought, but according to what I've read, Easton has 4 reservoirs either in or adjacent to their town or partially in their town. And those reservoirs are at least half of what Aquarion supplies to, I think, 11 towns, including Bridgeport. And therefore they and as well as the ones that are the water's being diverted to. So Easton reservoirs supply water to approximately 700,000 people in our state, including, I think, 96% of Bridgeport. So any bill that supersedes what Easton feels it needs to be the good stewards and a regional supplier of water is not acceptable. And the bills did not accommodate that.
And can I add a little bit on this again? I feel like I'm being the the negative person here, but thinking about those alternative sewers, those systems, there is a committee that was formed that was looking at these alternative sewer systems. They never discussed the increase that's listed in this bill and is listed in the Omnibus Rojas bill to increase the capacity from 7,500 to 10,000 gallons per day. That's really concerning. And especially they're trying to move the management of that from deep to the Department of Health, and in a state that has no experience on this yet. And they're giving a budget to hire 2 people statewide, I guess, to be the ones to have oversight of this. And there hasn't been a lot of discussion. It hasn't been in the press at all, but it should be really concerning to everybody that they're trying to create these alternative systems. And why are they, what does this do exactly? It's, so if you want to develop a cluster, a small group of homes, you want to have 6 or 8 homes, and you want them to be more dense, you can create one septic system for all of those homes together. And what we've seen, and these bills came last year as well, I believe the year before as well too. And what we've seen is that there have been failures in Rhode Island, failures in Massachusetts, failures in New York State. We received an email about a failure that happened in somewhere in Connecticut as well. And it's where housing authority ends up going out of business. These are harder to manage. They need to be inspected often. And we have to pay close attention to these things because there are environmental impacts. And as Catherine had mentioned before, you know, when they fail, it ends up, you know, that the housing authority is gone, and it ends up either being the state or the municipalities that have to clean up the damage. So, you know, that's the important thing that everybody needs to realize about some of these bills, and how it really is important that everybody pays attention to how it impacts our environment.
Yeah, thanks, Maria. Now, going back to the fair share bill, someone in the audience has a question. You said the fair share housing was modeled after New Jersey, and I've heard that this hasn't gone well in New Jersey. Is that true? And why would we model a bill after something in New Jersey?
That's a good question. It's a leading question, but I appreciate where it's leading us to. Why would we model anything off of New Jersey? So I think Maria actually understands this better than me, but I will just make a couple of mentions. A similar policy has been in existence in New Jersey. It is the only state, I think, where a similar policy is in existence. And in New Jersey, most of the building under fair share has been done at taxpayer expense. I think between 50 and 60% has been on the taxpayer dime rather than private development, which is why one of the major concerns is that this would constitute one of the largest, maybe the second largest unfunded mandate on towns and cities in the country. It's inauspicious that it's being offered here in Connecticut as well as New Jersey, because those are 2 of the states with the highest property tax burden already in the country, and states which have seen not great economic fortunes over the past decade or so. So, you know, again, I try not to interpret the rationale or intentions of my colleagues when I don't necessarily agree with them, but I think the evidence suggests what a rollout would look like. It would be at enormous expense to property taxpayers and towns and cities, if not a huge burden on them in other ways, and that in the places that it's been tried, it has not succeeded. It has not generated economic growth in New Jersey and success there either. So why borrow from their bad experiences and failed policies?
And, you know, I will add that I started doing some research on a couple of towns where I looked at some of their reports, and they dedicated maybe 10 to 20 pages on the history of how the implementation is going on this. And they literally had lawsuits after lawsuits and settlements. And it just, as a member of the Board of Finance, I always think about those costs that the towns incur when these sort of things start coming and rolling off. And so, and the one thing I think I was struck by was it didn't seem that any towns could meet their share within that set benchmark. And the other thing to remember is not only is this onerous for this 10-year cycle, once you've hit the 10-year cycle, they're going to create new numbers for every town to again create their fair share. And that's what's been happening in New Jersey. So you don't get off this this merry-go-round it's you know, really scary. And so I'll just give some quick numbers. I don't know if anybody, so we have a worksheet. Again, if you got our newsletter that went out today, there was a link to our worksheets, and the tab that talks about fair share has every town listed out. It tells you what your fair share number is before per Open Communities Alliance. It gives you a mid-range and a medium, a mid-range and a high and a low as to what it would cost to build. Now, so I can give you New Canaan. So New Canaan's got 1,350 units that we're required to build at the mid-range price, which we know is not even nearly what it would cost us, and that's without land as well. It's over 600 million to build our fair share, and that's, you know, nearly 4 times our annual budget. So it's really onerous. And that's what everybody needs to remember, is that if you can't find a developer that's going to come and build it, you still have to build it. And if you don't build it, then they're going to take away single family zoning everywhere. It's going to become default zoning, where it's 20 units per acre anywhere with town water, town sewer, and anywhere else it's as much as your septic and your water, your well can handle. And so that means just multifamily anywhere and everywhere. So, you know, that's not really what people signed up for when they purchased a home, or when they decided, you know, where they want to live, and you make your choices based on whatever are your priorities. And so this sort of is incredibly onerous, as Ryan mentioned. It is the worst bill that's out there from this session. And I guess I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, thanks, Maria. We have another question from Scott France, former state senator from Greenwich. Where do you think the governor stands on these bills? We haven't heard him say a whole lot. I know he's put forth his own bill. So what are we hearing?
Hey, Scott. I don't know. I know that he is in favor of his own bill. I hope that his bill can be more of a focal point of this year's agenda than other bills with some fixes. I think his bill and 1 or 2 other bills have more redeeming qualities than some of the other bills that have been proposed and passed through committee. I do not know where he stands or his administration stands on some of these other pieces of legislation. That is pretty much all I know currently. But I have been engaged with his administration on his bill, which is SB 985, and I do hope to make it better and keep the redeeming qualities and change some of, I think, some of the negative aspects of it to make it as good as possible. We do really try to actively make bills that have, I think, mixed qualities to them as good as possible. We really do engage with our friends on the other side of the aisle in order to accomplish that. You know, I just got a message from one of my colleagues along those lines about a bill that I think is one of the better ones in this on these topics that has been proposed. So we're always there to talk. We're always there to try to make things as good as possible. There are some of these bills that I think have very, very few redeeming qualities, like fair share or work, live, ride, and it's more difficult on those fronts. But certainly proposals like the governor's bill, or like 6777, which is the senior housing proposal from the House, from a House Democrat. We really do want to be there to make those bills as good as possible for the state, for everybody.
Yeah, thank you. And appreciate Senator France's engagement on these issues. Really important to have your voice. I want to move to a question that we have about the cities. I know back in 2020, Governor Lamont set this very ambitious goal about doubling the population of our cities in the next quarter century. Now, how would these bills impact the population of our cities if we're densifying the suburbs? Aren't we just kind of moving the population of the cities potentially to the suburbs? I mean, I guess I don't know if that question maybe not clear enough.
It is. Listen, it is, to the extent that the prescriptions and the policy here, both in existence and being moved forward currently, are prescriptive and shall we say, leverage the power of the state government. Yes, there are contradictions in them. The fact that there are a lot of carrots to development for shall we say, more distressed cities. But then there are a lot of sticks to development for some of the towns and some of the, shall we say, more middle class or growing cities. Those are kind of countervailing motivations and policies in many senses, because resources are scarce. And so, for instance, in the community investment fund, there's hundreds of millions of dollars that for investment in new affordable housing, but it goes entirely, I believe the only municipalities eligible are municipalities that are exempt from the 830G set aside development, which is, I think, very unfair to the towns that you're imposing this mandate on and saying you have no way around it. And by the way, we're not going to help you build nearly as much affordable housing as we are going to for these other towns, which are currently exempt from 830G. So, you know, I think that I would hope that we could stop bad stuff in this session. I would hope that maybe a couple of the bills that we do pass are made as good as possible. But next term, I would very much like for us to go to the drawing board and have stakeholders with different perspectives from different parties come to a meeting of the minds and say, let's rationalize the existing policy. Let's create new policy that develops affordable housing, that increases the housing stock in a way that has local buy-in, that supports our economy, and that doesn't hurt and undermine towns and their discretion and the quality of life there. So I do think, again, I do think there's a better way than our current policy and certainly than some of these proposals before us.
Thanks, Ryan. Kathy?
Yeah, so the 8-30G, I just want to talk about the 10%. So that was created 30 years ago to give developers, they didn't think towns were building enough affordable housing. They wanted developers to decide where and when to build it by incentivizing them, by making it easier to get a zoning approval, because the burden of proof shifts to the zoning commission on appeal. So 75% of all appeals of a denial by the zoning commission are overturned and given back to the developer because of that shifting of the burden of proof. But the problem is that the way I see it is that's a big problem. But the other problem is the 10% is the exemption amount. That's the towns that Senator Fazio just mentioned are exempt. They're the cities and the poor towns that historically have always received the funding to build housing projects for poor people, because that is where everybody that needed it was. So the towns never had that funding and they're still not getting that funding. So to be judged on the 10% standard, it is virtually a mathematical impossibility based on what the situation was in 1989 when the law was passed, where 30 or so cities were already exempt because that's where all the housing had been built, and other towns had a very small amount. But to expect them to take the amount of housing they had and ever get to 10% is almost impossible. And then you look at the way the formula is calculated, it's impossible because the funding is still going to the bigger cities to create housing, and the Section 8 housing vouchers are still going to the cities, and that's another metric by which we're judged. And CHAFA loans and USDA loans are randomly to different places, and we're judged on that also. So the 10% should never have been put in there. It was arbitrary. It's simply not rationally related to what the goal is, and it shouldn't be done. I think the goal might be to move people from the cities to the towns. I don't know how that helps the cities either. So,
all right. I know we're getting close to the end of the hour, and we do have more questions. And this one is probably more geared for Ryan. Now, can you explain what the process of what happens when a bill comes out of committee? What is the process of further modification? Then in addition, they want to know what's the chances of fair share being defeated now that it's advanced out of the committee?
Good question. And I would say it's really quite open-ended. I mean, there is a usual process, which is it goes through committee. It's either amended or in committee and passed, or passed as is, or rejected as it is. And then it goes to the full House and Senate floor, where it might or might not be amended before it goes to the floor or when it's on the floor, and has to go through both houses. And it's negotiated between the House and Senate leadership which House bill that's passed through the House is going to be brought through the Senate, and vice versa. And then obviously they're negotiating with the governor about what he is willing to sign or not as well, and which of his priorities they bring up as well. So it is pretty open-ended because of the numbers in the legislature. Obviously, there's a pretty significant majority in both houses. A lot of these things are negotiated more so within the caucus of the majority party than they are between caucuses, although they are negotiated between caucuses. And we love to be at the table. We love to try to make things as good and as reasonable as possible, especially in the face of some more aggressive legislation that is on the docket. But it is fairly open-ended. But I would say, generally speaking, now that bills are passed through committee, they will be amended. They will be aggregated into larger bills. Oftentimes, that obviously I think is suboptimal legislating. But by and large, in some form of what they pass through committee, these policies will either be voted on the full House and Senate floor in a similar form, or in an amalgamated form in a larger omnibus bill. And the fair share, I don't know. Frankly, I don't know what the exact appetite of the caucus is, which is why it's so important to round this entire discussion up, for everyone to stay engaged with their legislators and with other legislators, to let them know what their priorities are. We want local control. We want to also support economic opportunity and growth in the housing stock at the same time with community buy-in. There is a better way to do this than we are doing it now, and certainly than some of these more aggressive proposals on the table. So a lot is still up in the air, and that's generally the cadence of what the rest of the legislative session will look like from now until roughly June, first week of June.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Ryan. And then I know we're coming at the end of our hour, but I did want to ask Barry one question, because he does have a great city perspective, being in Stamford. What's the appetite in Stamford right now for all this? What are you hearing? I mean, we were there a few weeks ago at a forum, and we heard a lot of, opposition about so much development happening there already, and they're kind of getting weary of it. So what are you hearing as a neighborhood advocate and as a planner?
As a planner and both heavily involved here in our zoning and land use issues, people are getting disgusted, actually. They're very concerned with overdevelopment. They're concerned with the taxing of resources, the infrastructure that's not able to handle the growth, and a very high tax burden, or an increasing tax burden, that is put on the individual property owners. So you think with all the development, there would be a benefit. Right now, we add to our capital, our grand list, approximately $200 million a year, which is enviable. But we're told when we ask questions about it, it goes towards our OPEM and our expenses as a city for our employees. So it's really been a very mixed bag. The growth has not benefited really the tax base here, or the tax owners. We still get a large increase. Our mayor now is talking about split. We just went through a reval, but of splitting the tax burden over more than 1 year, 2 years, because she doesn't want to increase the taxes that much this year. So it's really been a very, very mixed bag. But I'd like to add, and I'm going to be very, very controversial, because this is about various housing bills. But our problem is not just housing, it's opportunity. Look at the fastest growing states we have in our nation. We have Florida, we have Texas, and Iowa. People are flocking to those states. People are moving in. The states are growing, businesses are growing. There's opportunity. We're basically stifling ourselves here. And part of it is our energy costs and our tax burdens. I mean, if you had a choice of locating a business, in any one of the 50 states, and I love Connecticut, why would you pick Connecticut? It's a beautiful state aesthetically, but yet we're not really growing the way we should. We're not really setting the opportunities here, and that's creating part of our housing problem here. True, and we're a fairly mature community, but we have older sections here in Stamford which could be available, but we don't have the policies in place that would make these desirable for newer or starting families. So it's really, these are complicated problems, but I think it really ought to start with, one is creating opportunities here and making sure businesses come here. You raised the question, we're actually tearing down office buildings to create more apartments. Where will that lead us in 10 years? We're basically, we're starting to chip away at our commercial base and our economic potential. So it's a very, very mixed bag. And you were at the meeting. You didn't hear anyone saying, they love what was going on. People are frustrated here. These are not the kind of policies we're talking about now, are not the right kind of policies to make us grow and make us vibrant. And maybe I'm not even sure we're really solving a housing problem, because we have something called low rate market housing, which isn't even the safety net kind of issues that we should be addressing. They're a percentage, maybe 30% below fair market, and fair market in this region is very, very high.
Okay,
I don't know if I answered your question, but
no, I think you did. We're past 8 o'clock, so you want to be sensitive to everybody's schedule tonight. But that was, I think, a great answer. Does anyone have anything they want to add before we close?
I would just, like to add, one of the comments we've heard is that we're just we say no, we don't have solutions. We absolutely have solutions, and we've been saying them quite often. One of them is definitely, we agree that the voucher system has to be fixed. And it's not just about centralizing a wait list, which is unfortunately just a limited amount of the problem. I think you have to look at allocations, because I think that's your path to being able to, it should be greater distribution statewide. There are numbers of towns that have 0 vouchers, or 2 or 5. And again, I encourage you to go look at that 830G chart to see where your town falls. Another thing is to have, consider having the funding sources. When you're just giving seed money mostly to the cities, you're ignoring the suburbs. And that's something that Ryan had mentioned. Like, we need to maybe expand that, give opportunities to towns that aren't in an alliance district or aren't distressed. And if you want to see development elsewhere, help that happen, because their costs and the barriers for development are very high. And then the third thing is something that Barry and I discussed offline a couple days ago, when we talked about Stanford's affordable. They're forever affordable, or 99 years affordable. So, the idea that we have shares of affordable that are, that these units that are rolling off, and we're just on this treadmill, maybe we need to start to rethink that as well. Maybe the units should be for the onerous ability for developers to override all of our zoning rules and stuff, that they should maybe consider making those forever affordable, because at least then you're not constantly fighting to just hold the ground you've gotten. So those are 3 thoughts that we have. We have plenty others.
Yeah, no, that's a great way to end.
For now.
Thank you. And, stay engaged, as Ryan said, go to our website, CT169Strong.org. Lots of information there. Go to our Facebook page. We're always updating it. And thank you very much for your time tonight. Looking forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.